Hey friends, it's Just the Gems. I'm Brandon. You know what's great? Villains. Not in real life. In real life, villains suck and should go to jail. But in video games, they can be really great. For me, a villain is most interesting when they're not just the ultimate evil. I like it when there's some nuance to them. Sometimes that means they're not even fundamentally bad, just that they have opposing goals to the heroes. But even when they do skew evil, I still prefer them to have something unique to their personality. So with that in mind, I wanted to make a video about my 10 favorite JRPG villains. Now, if you're rolling your eyes and thinking, a list video? In this economy? Let me just tell you why I like list videos. 2 reasons. 1, YouTube loves them for some reason. And 2, it gives me an excuse to talk about a bunch of different games I like. So I hope you'll stick around. Oh, and minor spoilers for the games in question. If you're looking forward to playing any of these, use the timeline to skip ahead. Before we dive in though, would you consider liking the video? Each click of the like button is like a handful of chum into the gaping shark's maw of the YouTube algorithm, and I greatly appreciate it. Also, if you're not subscribed and if you like the sort of stuff I do, would you think about clicking the subscribe button and ringing that bell or whatever? Yeah, that's enough of that. On to the list. Ultima is one of those villains that I randomly think about from time to time just because of how much he affected me while I was playing the game. Basically, he's a sort of god and maybe kind of an alien. The story of Final Fantasy XVI is pretty confusing, but the gist of Ultima's story is that he's part of a collective who escaped from a dying planet, came to this planet, and set in motion a plan to create a new world for themselves. They created humanity as a tool for that purpose. There are a couple of things that are really interesting about Ultima to me. For one, from a purely legal standpoint, he's technically in the right. The planet is his, he made everything on it, and the people choosing to defy him is a violation of whatever cosmic law he created. Now, naturally, something being legal doesn't necessarily mean it's right, and in this case, I would say humanity was fairly justified in wanting to break free, particularly since they'd developed free will during Ultima's long nap prior to the game's beginning. The other thing I find so fascinating about Ultima is the meta story surrounding him and so many elements of the game. I made another video about this, I'll link it in the description, but essentially I argue that Ultima represents the legacy of the Final Fantasy series as a whole, exemplified by the fact that there are 16 parts to him, among many other things. While the meta story itself might anger some longtime fans of the series who are maybe not as in favor of the changes Final Fantasy XVI brought about, I personally love it when creators tell sort of their own stories within the stories they're writing. The narrative of Final Fantasy XVI works on multiple levels and holds together really well considering how complex it is. Ultima is a top-tier villain for me because of what he means in every level of that story. Games that tell their stories in a longer format, like series that are all connected, have a distinct advantage in creating compelling villains in that they're bound to get more screen time and characterization. Albedo is one villain that really benefits from Xenosaga being a trilogy. Albedo's story is basically a tragedy from the very beginning. He's essentially immortal, and the game's portrayal of his immortality feels pretty realistic to me. While he might have enjoyed being immune to injury when he was younger, he came to realize pretty quickly the enormous burden his immortality actually was. His connections with his family were doomed to be severed because he was the only one among his brothers who would live forever. This fear of being left alone started the long process of mental scarring that would continue as he came into contact with the wave existence, a familiar term to fans of Xenogears, I'm sure, or Udu, as it's known in Xenosaga. Udu. As the years went on, he became a sadist and a masochist. He seemed to enjoy dishing out pain as much as he liked inflicting it on himself. It's easy to hate Albedo because of the terrible things he does, and really, there's no good excuse for those things. However, his backstory makes him so much more than a basically evil person. It makes him understandably evil. And to me, that's the hallmark of a villain that sticks with you long after the game is over. No names here. I'm trying to keep this video on the spoiler light side, and revealing the name of the killer in Persona 4 qualifies as a big honkin' spoiler. So we're gonna go with the killer for this segment. The killer is a pure sociopath. As you might expect from a game with the premise of a murder mystery, the killer is someone the characters encounter prior to learning their real identity. This in and of itself makes them pretty interesting because it can be a lot of fun to analyze all the characters you encounter for tells or clues to see if you can figure it out before the cast does. In the small town of Inaba, way out in the middle of nowhere in rural Japan, the killer has been living a life of boredom. Growing up with parents that didn't seem to care about them on any sort of personal level and only really pushed them to succeed in school, they developed a sense of entitlement and believed everything should just be given to them because of how inherently excellent they were. Maybe you know people like that. I do. They're not great. But while living their boring life in Inaba, they get an opportunity to murder a bunch of people and get away with it. And they do it just because they're bored. The killer in Persona 4 might be close to a pure evil character, but they make the list for two reasons. One, because of the mystery element I mentioned, and two, because of how freaking entertaining they are, both throughout the course of the story and when their true machinations get revealed. Persona games do a fantastic job of showing the dark sides of humanity, and few characters personify that dark side as well as the killer from Persona 4. Smithy makes this list not because of anything particular to the character himself. He's sort of a generically evil villain who wants to keep people's wishes from coming true. He's a jerk. But he's here because of what he represents, and it's something I'm hoping we'll see more of. See, the Mario universe, in my opinion, has gotten very, very stale. There's always one hero, Mario. There's always one villain, Bowser. Sure, there are side heroes like Luigi, Toad, Peach, Yoshi, and sure, there are side villains like the Koopa Kids and Bowser Jr. and Magic Koopa, I guess. But like, we get it, right? We've seen all that before. Super Mario RPG came onto the scene in the Super NES era and showed us the potential that lay down a different path. In Super Mario RPG, not only did we have a team of heroes, two of which were brand new, and one of which was previously a villain, for crying out loud, we also had an entirely new and never seen since bad guy to fight. The conservativeness of the Mario series became much stronger in the post-SNES world, and Nintendo imposed some fairly strict rules to limit new characters in the Mario universe. This is something I'm super comfortable saying is a mistake and a creative dead end. I'm sincerely hoping that the recent remake of Super Mario RPG for Switch will encourage Nintendo that the audience is very open to new characters and new ideas being explored in Mario games. The stories aren't the deepest, but the characters they bring us tend to be very beloved. See Geno. No reason they can't bring us more. Final Fantasy VII Remake shook a lot of the fan base when they realized, probably not too long after they began the game, that the term remake in the title wasn't exactly literal. Not only did events not always play out exactly as we remember them from the PlayStation 1 Classic, but some entirely new events occur that provide richer details to the world and the story. But occasionally, when it seems like things are about to occur in a way that's different than we remember, something happens. These freaking Grim Reaper looking things show up and start messing with everything. Most people can't see them at all. Only Aerith and the people she's come into physical contact with have any idea that they're there at all. These are the Whispers, or the Arbiters of Fate as we come to know them. They're working at the behest of the planet, maybe, to ensure that events happen the way they're destined to. The fact that Aerith seems to have a decent idea about what they are, as well as a pretty good sense for what's about to happen from time to time, suggests that maybe, just maybe, something quite a bit more than a simple remake is happening here. I love the Whispers because, to me, they're another example of Square Enix utilizing meta-narratives. I see the Whispers as a representative of the hardcore fans of the original Final Fantasy VII. They want this remake to be essentially an HD shot-for-shot remake of the game they love so much. The developers are the cast of the game in this metaphor, in that they're actively fighting against that fate, because they have new ideas that they want to bring to the world of Final Fantasy VII. Now, whether that's actually the intention of the storytellers or not, I can't say for sure. But it makes sense to me, and I can understand why that interpretation might bother some people, especially those that don't care for the changes in the remake trilogy. In a sense, they might see themselves cast as the villains in a story that they've championed for a long time. But I don't see it that way. I'm someone who initially was very much in favor of a shot-for-shot, HD-ified remake of Final Fantasy VII, so I can admit I felt some pangs of disappointment when it became clear that wasn't exactly what was on the menu. But I pretty quickly got on board with what the storytellers are doing here. For those that just can't get on board, believe me, I get it. I've heard some people compare this to something like the original Star Wars movies, where George Lucas made changes to the trilogy that upset some fans. The difference here is that whereas Lucas killed off the original version as entirely as he could, the OG Final Fantasy VII is available and playable on just about every machine under the sun. And I would argue that playing the original Final Fantasy VII is absolutely key to fully enjoying the nuances of the remake trilogy. The Whispers really want to tell the story their way, but I'm honestly excited to see what the creative team has in store. The Trail series has been telling the story of the land of Zemuria for 20 years now. And in that time, there have been a lot of different villains. Sometimes a villain is only around for a game or two, sometimes for an entire arc. But by and large, these villains have their time on the stage and then they step aside for whoever comes next. However, one villain that's remained constant from the beginning is the shady secret organization Ouroboros. In every tumultuous event that happens in this world, you're bound to find an agent of Ouroboros lurking in the background, pulling strings. Every major villain seems to have some connection with them, whether they're just puppets of the Ouroboros Grandmaster or doing their best to outsmart them for their own diabolical purposes. Actually, pulling strings is kind of a blunt way of putting it. In reality, they're weaving threads. Whatever their big plan is, they're creating a tapestry across the entire continent. And in doing so, they're causing enormous amounts of trouble for everyone. But are they actually bad? Well, we don't know yet. I have a feeling we'll be talking about the motives of Ouroboros for a long time to come. But in the meantime, it's always exciting to encounter one of their enforcers, like Campanella or Shirley the Sanguine Ogre. Fun fact, I wasn't sure what sanguine really meant, so I looked it up. And it means both blood red and optimistic or positive, even in a difficult situation. So I guess that's a pretty good word for her. She does seem pretty positive despite all the bad situations she finds herself in. Though, I guess she's typically the one causing the bad situations, so maybe that doesn't count. Anyway, Ouroboros is great, and I can't wait to see what they're up to in the Trails Through Daybreak arc. Chrono Trigger's villain is supposed to be hard to really wrap your head around. Lavos is this list's cosmic horror villain. Lavos is unknowable, incomprehensible. It's a being that is somehow larger than all of life. It's an interstellar parasite, just one of probably trillions of similar parasites that spawn on a dying world and launch themselves off to find a new world worth eating. It burrows deep into the earth and sets down roots, and it's somehow able to control the direction of evolution on each planet to serve its needs. At best, this could end up being a symbiotic relationship, right? Lavos gets to eat and to live, and hey, because it helped us evolve, we get to lead meaningful lives, right? Well, of course not, because then you don't really have a villain. No, instead, Lavos is doing all of this with the chaotic intention of destroying everything on the planet once it's done with it. Our heroes are traveling through time, minding their own business without much concern except for staying out of trouble, when they stumble upon a record that shows Lavos emerging from the core of the Earth in the year 1999 and destroying everything. All that's left of the world is a shattered husk. Lavos then proceeds into retirement, hanging out on the top of a treacherous mountain and giving birth to a whole bunch of spawn. It's just kind of a cosmic jerk, really. But in Chrono Trigger, it's such a cool backdrop to the whole story. There are other villains you'll face along the way, misguided weirdos that want to try and harness Lavos' power in order to rule the world and all that, but in the end, Lavos is the beginning and end of the crisis the world finds itself in. A bunch of time-traveling teenagers find themselves up against an amoral god of destruction, and when it comes to villains in video games, it's hard to be much cooler than that. Xenogears is one of my favorite games, and that's primarily because of the story it tells. This was a story that fully ignited my imagination. It actually showed me a lot about what it means to be a person. It taught me how to question things I'd always been told but never shown. It had a cast of characters a mile wide and a mile deep, with complex villains, with motivations that were admittedly a little hard for me to wrap my teenage brain around. But replaying the game as an adult gave me an even greater appreciation for what was going on in that story, and it reinformed Krellian as one of my favorite JRPG villains. See, Krelian is the victim of heartbreak. It's hard not to sympathize with that because we've all experienced that emotion in one form or another. His heartbreak leads him to question the existence of God and eventually decide that if God isn't real, then he'll just have to create one. Honestly, there's so much going on in Xenogears, so many different plays in motion that it can be easy to lose Krelian's thread in the plot, but his is by far the most important, and it's the major cause of most of the conflict in the world. By appointing himself as a sort of savior, he's basically saying he knows best for all of humanity, and you know how that sort of thing usually goes. Not well. But since Xenogears is such a long game with so much story, we really get a sense for Krelian's history, and it's honestly hard not to sympathize with him. The world he grew up in was incredibly messed up. He wanted to make one that was better. Unfortunately, he didn't realize that by trying to do so, he'd only make things worse. Krelian is the epitome of the tragic villain, and he'll always be a favorite. If you played Final Fantasy VII, you probably remember Hojo. He's the mad scientist who's always running around in the background scheming something. He's almost kind of comic relief at times. He's disheveled and focused on his work to the extreme. He thinks he can mate Aerith, a human woman, with Red 13, a red dog cat thing. He's pretty messed up. The thing is, though, that basically everything that happens in Final Fantasy VII is a result of Hojo. Well, of Hojo and Hollander. You could also throw Gast onto this list, I suppose, though Gast is the only member of the Jenova project that seems to have had a change of heart in the end, so let's give him a pass. But both Hojo and Hollander are scientists so driven by selfish desires that they're willing to sacrifice essentially anyone and anything to get what they want. Hollander's desires are maybe even more selfish because he's purely motivated by jealousy at what Hojo's been able to accomplish. Now, if you've only ever played Final Fantasy VII, you're probably not familiar with Hollander at all. His story is told in Crisis Core, the prequel, starring everyone's favorite soldier, Zack Fair. But Hollander's creation of the G project and Hojo's creation of the S project essentially set the gears in motion. Without Hojo and Hollander, Sephiroth isn't manipulated into doing everything he does. So I think it's fair to lay a significant chunk of the blame on their shoulders. I'm really glad the new trilogy is incorporating characters and storylines from Crisis Core and the other Final Fantasy VII media out there, because I think the depth and breadth of the world is so significantly improved with those additions. And the story of Hojo and Hollander is a big part of that. Without their twisted ambitions, there's no Jenova project, and without the Jenova project, there's no Sephiroth. It's a pretty straight line. He's the clown that'll make you frown. He's the jester who wants the world to fester. I can't think of a third one. Sorry. But he's Kefka. There's no way anyone has written a list like this without including Kefka. At least, I'm guessing not. I don't have the time to read every list like this out there. If you find one, let me know in the comments, because I just find it impossible to believe one could exist. Kefka is the prototypical villain in almost every sense of the word. He's evil enough to poison an entire city, killing almost every single person. He's evil enough to kidnap and torture magical creatures to extract power out of them. He's evil enough to throw the entire world into a state of unbalance just because, well, that's the thing. We don't really know why he does the things he does. It's not even clear that Kefka knows why he does the things he does. He's just anarchy personified. You might even find it weird that he's on this list at all, let alone in the top spot, considering how much I like a deep and nuanced villain. Well, look. Kefka is the exception that proves the rule, okay? He's the first video game character I ever truly hated, and I love him for that. The game only ever gives us the tiniest crumbs about his past, and there's been a lot of speculation over the years, naturally. We know that he was experimented on, which likely contributed to his insanity. We don't know anything about his past, really, unless you believe the theory about his connection to a certain shady party member who has the occasional flashback dream sequence about a mysterious man. He's an enigma, and on top of that, he just wants to destroy everything. Like, I guess you can argue he wants power. He seems to enjoy having power, but he just wants to use that power to destroy things. He's by far the most nihilistic villain I've ever encountered in a piece of media. And on top of that, he's a clown, and I've always been terrified of clowns, so bonus points, I guess. Anyway, that's it. What do you think? Any villains I should have included? I'm sure 100 of you are typing Luca Blight as I speak. And look, I probably would have included him, but it's been so long since I played Suikoden 2, I just remember very little about it. So maybe he makes the next list. With that, I hope you've enjoyed this, and until next time, bye.